Hi guys, my name is Fred Barton and I spent 9 years in China, firstly as an English teacher, then as a freelance interpreter and translator, and finally as a foreign policy analyst and interpreter at the British Embassy in Beijing. And in this video, I want to share with you the 9 biggest lessons that I learned over those 9 years in China. The first lesson that I learned was the importance of family. I started off in China teaching English in a middle school, and the concept from Confucianism of filial piety would keep coming up in lessons. The children would often talk about how they wanted to be a good son or a good daughter, get a good job and look after their parents as they got older. And they talked about being a filial son. And I had never come across this term, I had never considered it. And coming from a Western background, I was always encouraged to leave the family at age 18, to go out into the world, find my own path in life. And I considered myself very separate from my parents. I didn't have a close relationship with them. But after this time in China, I really started to consider the importance of family and how it's really only right and fair that as a son to my parents who's received so much financial support, emotional support and care from them over the years, it's only really right that I would give back to them in old age. So I started to consider this a lot, and I started to try and send money to my parents as a way of paying back some of the things that they had provided for me. I invited them out to China and helped them find a job actually teaching English in China. So we were actually all reunited in China. And it was a very important concept for me, this idea of filial piety and trying to give back to my parents as they got older. And that's something that stuck with me. And the second thing I learned in this near decade in China was that the Chinese government and the Chinese people are very separate. I'm not a shill for the Chinese government. I'm not a shill for the UK government. I don't really want to bring any politics into this video at all. But I was really surprised at how warm, friendly, funny, earthy, very down to earth, just actually quite laid back the Chinese people are. And this is nothing like the image that we're given in the West. Before I went to China, I actually thought Chinese people were more like Japanese people. It had all been lumped together in my imagination. I thought they were very strict, very formal. The group that I went with when we first went to China, we instinctively started to bow and stuff like this to people in restaurants when we were coming in, and we didn't know that this is not done at all. So I had a lot of misunderstandings about China. Yes, of course, we know about the Chinese government, we know about the Communist Party, but the Chinese people, it's a completely separate thing. On an individual level, they are so warm and very friendly and in some ways quite innocent compared to, especially the younger people, like innocent compared to, say, Western teenagers. There isn't the knife crime, there isn't the rampant levels of drug abuse, and they're very sweet, a lot of the younger Chinese, and they're so hospitable. There were so many times that I was given so much kindness by local Chinese people, and it made me really realize, oh wow, you know, this image that we're given of Chinese people of somehow being synonymous with the government and China is terrible and that means Chinese people are terrible. It's not correct as far as I'm concerned. On a person-to-person basis, the Chinese people are some of the most down-to-earth, friendly, kind people that you could meet, and very fun-loving too in a lot of ways. I was invited out many times for big meals. I would get drunk with people, make good friends, and it was just, I had a really good laugh out there and a really good time. So I definitely learned to separate the idea of the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party and the government and Chinese people on an individual level. The third thing I learned in China was actually related to the second thing, and having received so much hospitality, it made me think about how I could be more hospitable and be a better host and just more generous in many ways. Being a Westerner, I'm very used to splitting the bill with my friends when we go out for meals, but having been in China for so long, that is seen as a little bit miserly and a little bit petty. So I much preferred to just pay for a meal and just say, look, you know, you get the next meal when we go out again or something like that, more like a round system like we would have in the pub. Rather than fighting over the bill and splitting the pennies. In China, people actually fight over who's going to pay the bill. It's seen as a real, you know, a positive thing if you're the guy that treats everybody. And this included on my birthday. The tradition in China is that you invite people out for your birthday, but then you pay for everybody. And I thought this was a really nice gesture. So to me, this seemed like a bigger, more generous way of doing things rather than the very individualistic way that I was used to coming from England, as I say, where everything is split up very carefully and we divide everything. And I just tried to be more hospitable. Like if people came to my town to visit me, I would pay for everything for them because that's the tradition in China. when you're in someone's town, they treat you. And I just tried to be more generous and a better host because that was the kind of hospitality that I had received myself. The fourth thing China taught me was to have a better understanding of my body. And this is related to Chinese medicine and Chinese energy arts. In China, most people have a pretty good understanding of what foods will do certain things to your body, what things you should eat when you've got a cold or if you've got a cough, or certain home remedies that you can use, different fruits and different vegetables that will be able to treat illnesses. And this is not something that I'd come across in England. I had a very disconnected idea between what my body does and the food that I eat and what I put into it. I thought they were kind of separate. I could eat trash and still feel okay, or I didn't put things together. For example, if I ate a lot of cold yogurt out of the fridge and then later on I got diarrhea, I wouldn't think, oh, that's because I ate too much cold yogurt and it's giving me diarrhea. Whereas in China, they have a very good knowledge of this kind of stuff, like what different foods will do to you, what different temperatures will do to you. At first, it seemed a little bit over fussy when I got to China, but as I got more into it, it gave me a real in-depth understanding, and I was able to cure problems in my body. If I knew that I was having a bit of throat pain coming on, I would I'd boil up some pears with ginger and this kind of stuff, and could make my own little home remedies. So it was really interesting to me how your average Chinese person has a much better understanding of the energy systems and stuff in the body. They would use stuff like Tai Chi and do different kinds of exercises, and they were more in touch with their bodies than I'd been used to in the West. I just used to abuse my body with different substances and different foods and never really thought like, oh, that's causing that effect. So for example, in China, there's a concept called shanghuo, which means to have an outburst of fire. And for example, I would eat a whole durian fruit, which in China belongs to the category of hot foods. And I would eat a whole durian, and then the next day I would have a big swollen nose. And my colleague would say, oh, 你上火了. You've had this outbreak of fire. And I didn't understand that before. I didn't realize the foods that I was eating were directly leading to outbreaks in my skin and stuff like that. So this was very interesting to me, and it gave me a more detailed understanding of how to eat properly and how to look after my body. The fifth thing my time in China taught me was just what a huge impact Chinese culture has had on East Asia generally. And I realized that Chinese culture is basically akin to Greco-Roman culture in Europe. That's what China's culture is to East Asia, and even parts of Southeast Asia, and how their writing system had spread throughout Korea and Vietnam and Japan, and how classical texts were usually written in Chinese pictograms. And prior to living in China, I had no real concept of just the depth and breadth of Chinese culture and its technology, its inventions, the writing, the glass, the paper, all of these things, and how it had really impacted traditional Japanese culture with the kimono, and also Korean culture and Vietnam. As I say, I couldn't appreciate this before living in England, and I really started to see how the main centers of culture had affected the whole world, with the Greco-Roman culture in Europe, Chinese culture in East Asia, and the Indus Valley culture in South Asia. And I got a better understanding of how these flows of technology and ideas had affected our world and shaped the world that we live in. The sixth thing I learned was a real paradigm shift, and that was that there are two sides to every story. And I was quite shocked when my students challenged me on certain things, and they started asking me questions about things like the Opium Wars. And I knew nothing about this, and they would bring up other episodes that were less than glorious from British history, and I knew nothing about them. And they said to me, well, you think that we're brainwashed by our state-run media, but you've been brainwashed by the BBC. And I never felt that I had been brainwashed by the BBC, but I did also become aware that every country's press has its own bias and slant and is propagandist to some extent. But the fact that I knew nothing about these episodes from British history, which were quite disgraceful, the way that we had forced countries to get addicted to drugs so that we could offset our own trade deficit with them. And it made me question, why are these things not taught in British schools? Why are we not aware of the atrocities and things that have been perpetrated in the name of British imperialism in the past? So this was very, very interesting. And even, the arguments for Marxism and communism and socialism vis-a-vis capitalism. I'm not saying I agree with all of them, but it's very interesting to just see the other side of the argument and to also see this kind of post-colonial mindset where China sees itself as a kind of subordinate, subaltern other, although it doesn't so much now, but in the past, it very much saw itself as a country which had been abused and badly treated by imperial powers and had ripped apart, and it was now trying to reform itself and become great again. So it's very interesting to see these counter narratives to what I had grown up with and what I was used to. And Chinese people have such a different view on just about everything. It's very challenging for your brain. You know, it's not much good really for your mental development if you just read Western liberal press, and I would read and consume media that confirmed my own views on things. So it's very good to get out of this echo chamber and hear completely opposing views on things. And this could even be like, we would drink cold beer and Chinese people would say, that's really bad for you. You should only drink room temperature beer because the cold liquid will sap all the energy away from your organs, and that's not good for you. So they would challenge you on many, many things from a very basic everyday level to much higher level political and social issues. So it's very challenging for the brain and really made me question a lot of things and was very interesting from a philosophical viewpoint. The seventh thing I learned in China over my time there was the importance of education. And I really enjoyed being in China because there's quite a wholesome, studious atmosphere in a lot of the cities that I lived in. The streets were often lined with cram schools for learning English or studying maths or learning piano or musical instruments, calligraphy, whatever it might be. And it had a very positive impact on me. I'd come from England where young guys were playing video games and smoking cannabis and just wasting their time. And then now I was in this environment that was really conducive to study. And I'd actually always really enjoyed learning when I was younger. And I found that being in China, I then started learning Chinese and I began learning calligraphy. And it was a very wholesome, positive environment to be in because there wasn't such a prevalence of drinking and drug taking among younger people. And there was more emphasis on education, and it inspired me to be more studious. The eighth thing that I learned was to be more responsible. In China, one of the biggest put downs that you can give to a man is to say, 你没有责任感, means you have no sense of responsibility. And coming from an individualistic, freedom-loving Western background, I always thought responsibility was boring. I equated responsibility with dullness and just basically boring. But being in China, it did shape me in that way, and there were often lots of reminders to be more responsible. And instead of me equating responsibility with the antithesis of fun and freedom, I started to equate it more with manliness and being a proper man and being responsible and masculine. A real man is responsible, looks after the things that he's supposed to do. And it helped me mature because I went to China as a 22-year-old and I was a bit wild and a bit rough around the edges. And a few times I was chided for having 没有责任感, no sense of responsibility. So it helped to ground me more, and it did help me to mature as well and be more responsible. The ninth thing I learned during my time in China is that despite the massive differences between the two cultures, between England and China, and all the differences in language and everything else, that actually people the world over are more similar than they are different. And I really discovered this through my study of Chinese language. There were many idioms or turns of phrase or concepts in language that were exactly the same in Chinese as they were in English. And they weren't borrowed concepts. They had developed individually and separately, but just through the shared human experience of what it is to go through life as a human being. And I found this very noticeable and quite heartwarming as well, quite touching, that these two cultures evolved on opposite sides of the planet, and yet we came to the same conclusions about life, and these were recorded in our languages. And just from getting to know people in China and spending so much time with them, you just realize that people are basically the same on a fundamental level. They want the same things in life. They want security, happiness, you know, family, prosperity, and all these things. So those are my 9 lessons that I learned from living in China for 9 years. If you like this content, you're going to like this video and this video, so check these out, and I'll speak to you soon.